two people getting in the same exact car accident, they've done studies on this, or two soldiers can come home from the same war, and one will have full-blown PTSD and one will not. They both had very, very similar, if not absolutely identical experiences, but how it's affecting them in the now is very, very different. And so extraordinarily cautious of saying something like, well, everyone has trauma, or everyone has, clinically significant trauma that needs some sort of therapeutic attention, or it needs to be healed. Because for me, it's like, well, what kind of story do we want to tell ourselves, like, about our lives?
Welcome to Modern Enlightenment, a sanctuary for your soul, where we'll go on a path of personal and spiritual development. I'm Austin Mao.
And I'm Chuchu Wang. We are your companions on this journey of self-discovery and spiritual connection.
Join us as we delve into the fusion of modern psychotherapy, neuroscience, psychospirituality, and shamanic plant sacrament ceremonies, exploring the transformative potential of psychedelics for the mind, body, and spirit.
Our mission is to guide you to a place of profound awareness where emotions can be felt.
Together, let's illuminate the way to a brighter, more enlightened existence.
Modern Enlightenment, where your journey to inner peace begins.
Welcome to another episode of Modern Enlightenment. I'm really excited to welcome my guest this week, Joe Nucci, who's a psychotherapist based in New York, a content creator, and an author that I had the pleasure of meeting at a recent trip to Cabo San Lucas. Hey, Joe, welcome.
Hey, Austin. I'm excited to be here.
When we met in that beautiful setting, it was with a group of founders and entrepreneurs, right? And this is an organization called Baby Bathwater that I was facilitating at and you've been a part of for some time. And I remember we had this really intriguing conversation that began around psychedelics and trauma. And maybe I think we had some conversation around the use or maybe the abuse of ketamine in that space. And I'm really curious. First, I'd just love to hear your journey to becoming this version of Joe Nucci. And if there was a role in entheogens in that, would love to hear about that too.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I guess it depends on how far back you want to start. I can make up a lot of different things about why I got into this field, why I'm interested in human behavior. We could make up stuff about different traumas or tragedies that have happened to me. We could talk about my dad passing away, or, growing up as a sexual minority, or all these things. But really, I think all that is secondary to the story that I'm about to tell you, which is a story my mom tells. And my mom tells this story where I was I was like 4 or 5 years old, and her and my dad were like bickering about something, not, just in a way that adults do. They have disagreements. And she says I got like the Post-its, like the yellow or pink, like sticky notes. And I would like watch them and I would make these like tallies. And then I would give them back to my parents when I was little. And so I share that because I think that part of why we do what we do, whatever it is, whatever we're called to, I think it's partially genetic or spiritual or whatever your kind of belief system is. And that set me up on a certain path in life. My first real introduction to the self-development human potential space was actually working with a psychologist, mostly in retreat settings. Very similar to how I understand a lot of like psychedelic retreats or different retreats using substances or different kinds of medicine work. And it was very interesting because my early mentorship, she was very opposed to the idea of using psychedelics or really anything like that. And her whole thing was like, we got to focus on the talking cure. We got to be able to, with a clear mind and clear heart, like go in to different parts of ourselves and to each other, et cetera, et cetera. And I wouldn't say that I'm hardlined like her, because I have gone on different therapeutic kind of plant medicine journeys. I'm not sure if I'm using like the right like jargon. I would love to know what you think after I'm done with my bit here. But all that to say is I'm very appreciative of that experience with her, that early mentorship, because I think that a lot of the work I did do on myself at that time, I really met my limits and edges in terms of like how much I could push myself or how much I could expand or access unconscious material, et cetera, et cetera. And for a while, I mostly agreed with her. It's not that I was against psychedelics or plant medicine or anything. It wasn't anything that ever interested me. And then it was a couple of years ago at this point, maybe a little bit longer now, I did have my first retreat experience where we took in San Pedro, which I believe is also referred to as Wachuma. I might be mispronouncing that. And also psilocybin or magic mushrooms. And in a retreat setting, it was the facilitators were clinicians. They were psychologically trained, but they were also very, very spiritual. They were a little bit woo-woo, some might say. And I actually kind of loved that because it was amazing being able to, talk about like neurochemistry in one moment and then talk about like something very kind of like spiritual and kind of otherworldly like the next, and the way they integrate it together. I really enjoyed, and I found that experience to be really incredibly therapeutic. I thought that for me, the San Pedro had a much bigger impact, is my experience, than the psilocybin. But it hasn't been something that I've done since, but it is something that comes up in my work. Patients will let me know that they're going on a retreat or that they've been microdosing, not typically under the guidance of anyone in particular, but it's a conversation that's in culture, and that's how they want to go about it. And I have people who have, done the different kind of asynchronous treatments like ketamine, like at home with like different like prompts and stuff like that. I know people personally who have done that, and also patients or clients that I've worked with have also shared those experiences with me. So it's not the space that I work in, but I'm always kind of keeping an eye on it because I think there's a lot of interesting and exciting stuff happening.
Something that I'm with is, at the beginning end of what you were sharing as your story was almost like snapshots of things that you could talk about that might be classified under the umbrella of trauma with a capital T, right? And then navigating to the place of, well, this has been your, something that has interested, there's a mechanism in your mind that's around understanding things that seems to have been there since you were a kid. These are my words, right? My story. And then number two, like kind of fast forwarding to the present or close to present moment of the training that you've had as an adult and the understanding of yourself that came from that. And it reminds me of this notion of the third wave of psychology, which I imagine you're familiar with. The first wave being Pavlov, we're no different than dogs, ring a bell, they salivate. We have desires, and when they get fulfilled, that's what we want to keep going after. Second is cognitive behavioral therapy, or talk therapy, like you've shared earlier. And this third wave, which is different ways to look at it, generally speaking, mindfulness based, but it's really about approaching ourselves in the present moment, right? And it reminds me of a sidebar conversation that we had about a week ago on talking about how popular media around mental health can often so focus on trauma, right? Like your past as defining who you are today. Whereas my orientation, and I imagine your orientation too, is about exploring what do we feel about ourselves today, which can be informed by, what happened to us in the past or how we see ourselves in the future. Does that land?
It does. And it's always an interesting concept or phenomenon to get present to, because I think that a lot of the people that are, maybe I'll label them as a little bit more generous with how they apply trauma and like using what they call like a trauma informed lens on like the human psyche or on mental health treatment. They often cite all this really wonderful like literature and research around trauma that's out there. But my understanding of all of that, not just all that evidence, but also all of the kind of anecdotal institutional experience that clinicians just kind of pass on, to their supervisees and in classes, et cetera, reflects exactly what you're talking about, which is it's not so much the existence of a trauma in the past, it's your relationship to it right now. So we know, for example, that two people getting in the same exact car accident, they've done studies on this, or two soldiers can come home from the same war, and one will have full-blown PTSD and one will not. They both had very, very similar, if not absolutely identical experiences, but how it's affecting them in the now is very, very different. And so that's the part A of what I wanted to reflect back to you. But then part B is, I think it's less about like what the evidence says or doesn't say, but it's more just you can almost think of it as like a philosophical disposition, or maybe it's a temperamental thing. But I'm extraordinarily cautious of saying something like, well, everyone has trauma, or everyone has, clinically significant trauma that needs some sort of therapeutic attention, or it needs to be healed. Because for me, it's like, well, what kind of story do we want to tell ourselves like about our lives as they've unfolded all around us? Like, and to your point, what story are you telling yourself right now about your life? That can have a profound impact on your well-being, on your mental health, and like I think the future trajectory of your life as well. And there's plenty of studies and also just kind of best practices in coaching and psychotherapy about that as well. I mean, mindset makes it sound a little gimmicky, but there is something to that I think is often overlooked when people want to see trauma and everything.
Yeah, I think about this very simple framework that when I do some coaching, I begin with asking or sort of inviting a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, right? And what I often see is that when we carry certain beliefs about ourselves, like this trauma makes me who I am, or I have PTSD, or I have depression/anxiety, that belief can create a feedback loop, leading us into a really fixed mindset because I am this thing. I'm carrying this identity of this thing that is keeping me in this box, right? And it's not a black or white, it's a spectrum. Like you can be somewhat fixed in mindset and somewhat growth in mindset, right? But what I've observed is that those that have a more growth mindset orientation tend to grow a lot quicker, a lot more deeply, a lot more easefully than those that are stuck in their ways. And as I was hearing your story, it really seemed like your development towards not only being a therapist, but towards having this, what I'm perceiving as a growth mindset, comes from, the story I'm making is like, it comes from challenges that you've experienced and how you've met those challenges in your life to arrive at a place where you're like, oh, like I am not those stories that, yeah. Does that land for you?
Yeah. Yeah, it does. There's this other like perspective that we're touching on here. I'm forgetting the name of the psychologist. It's Andrew Solomon, maybe at Cornell, but he gives this TED talk where he talks about, the worst moments in our life make us who we are. And he delivers it in kind of like the growth mindset framework that you were talking about. It's like the sense of identity and meaning and purpose and drive that we like derive from these experiences. And I think it's an absolutely lovely sentiment. I think it's absolutely true. I just also happen to think it's incomplete because I think that we are also shaped by a bunch of positive reinforcement and positive feedback.
Totally.
And it's funny because, sometimes when I've spoken on this topic of trauma, it can invite a lot of strong emotion and strong beliefs, in comment sections or in dialogue with whoever I'm with. And of course, we can like make room for all of it, right? And I'm kind of sitting here being like, but what I just said feels so self-evident to me. I'm saying that half of life is positive by definition. Now, maybe your positive is more or less positive than somebody else's, and same thing with trauma or negative events or tragedies. I'm not discounting that. I'm not discounting that there's like a gradient there. I'm just saying that it's still your experience and it's still shaping you in this present moment.
Yeah, there's this guru that I often like citing, this Guru Sri Ravikar, that says holding paradox is one of the highest states of consciousness, right? AKA non-duality. And it feels like there's this polarization between detail and an expansive view, or maybe the image of, can you look at the forest and simultaneously can you also see the details of the trees, right? And what I see as something very interesting that's happening is that, to me, the spiritual lens is looking at the forest from above, right? Everything's perfect in its imperfection. Everything is in its right place. Whatever's happened to you, both positive and negative, has made you who you are today. And what psychotherapy or psychology can offer is the nuanced skillfulness to identify, become self-aware, and work with like your feelings, your thoughts, your content that is underneath. And I think that when, what I see is I've worked with a lot of different facilitators, a lot of different psychologists and scientists. There can often be like a fixed mindset from people in both of those specialties, right? Whether that be someone leaning more spiritual, shamans, for example, or those that are leaning more clinical, right? Researchers, as an example. And I can see how sometimes they become very fixed in their framework of how to view the human mind or the human spirit, And something I've appreciated about being with you is that it feels like you have I'm looking at the plethora of books behind you. Like it feels like you have certainly the education and the knowledge and the skill to communicate this. But also I've appreciated being with you as you've appeared to me like to have an openness, to have the spiritual perspective, like even your appreciation of the woo-woo, in that retreat that you went to. And yeah, I'm just enjoying that.
Yeah. Well, A, thank you. B, there's this quote, I think, is it like Don Russo? It's one of the Enneagram kind of pioneers, at least in the Enneagram's modern manifestation. And the quote goes something like, a psychology that is, devoid of spirituality, I think was his exact word, is a psychology that like can't possibly like apply to like the human experience. And I find that to be absolutely true. It's something that I think has always kind of guided my personal philosophy. I also think that, people forget that mindfulness, as you pointed out, was totally laughed at a few decades ago as like a legitimate modality. And now if I'm like, telling my doctor I'm like, I've had some hard time sleeping, and, maybe they've forgotten what I do for a living, or they don't know. And they're like, well, have you tried mindfulness? And so I think there's also one of the things they really beat into you in grad school is to have radical humility when you're working with people, because they know their life better than you do, despite all the books you've read and all the experience you have. It doesn't mean you're not good at your job. It doesn't mean you can't help them, but it's just to kind of approach things with that openness and curiosity. And I think I've always had that temperament, but I think it's certainly just being trained as a clinician, I think it only pushed me further in that direction. And I really believe in this principle, like what you were pointing to, of like the dialectic of like sitting in the paradox. Some of the, happiest moments I have felt, like the most blissful, like the most joy, have also sometimes moments that have incorporated like some sadness, or some disappointment. It's about having access to all of it. Early on in my journey, I was definitely someone who was stuck in their head, very rational, intellectualized everything, like very like up here. And it's been amazing to see how much more powerful of a tool all that, like that analytical energy I have is when I like let myself go down like into the heart. And, I get better with that, just like with life and with practice, with mindfulness. Have you ever heard that I wish the joke was mine because I think it's so brilliant, but it's basically like people that are too material, no, it's people who are too spiritual are delusional, but people that are too material are just dead inside. It's so funny because I feel like we all know people that are, very woo, and every once in a while their take, I'm like, what the heck are you even referring to? It is just so out there, right? And it's sad because I'm like, I don't even think you realize how far off the reservation you've gone. But then you talk to a clinician who won't ever break from their checklist or protocol when treating somebody, and they're wondering why, they can't keep a patient or why they're not like making progress and stuff. And it's just like, dude, like drop down for a second, like you can do both.
Totally. I was just speaking to an alumnus yesterday of Ceremonia who came a year ago, and she's this executive, right, that can often work to past midnight. And she was sharing that some of the things that she's been going through recently, a few years ago, version of her would have buckled under the pressure. Yeah. But now she has so much of a greater resilience because of the inner work that she's done. And the reflection that I got is that people often come to me and believe that it's a zero-sum game between being in the mind versus being in the heart, right? Like if I go and be in my feelings more, then I'm not as good a performer in my business, as a CEO, so on and so forth. Whereas my experience is it's the complete opposite, that we unlock reasonable amounts of energy because we didn't have a frame of reference for it before. When we're able to unlock some of the protectors that have been wrapped around gripping our heart, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it makes sense to me intuitively. I've experienced that myself just over my own journey. And I actually think there's a lot of evidence to back up what you're saying when in the studies of people with antisocial personality disorder, people who have psychopathy or a sociopath or psychopath, they have found that one of the symptoms is they're fairly impulsive. They're very bad at planning. And so what does that mean? Impulse means you act without thinking. And that obviously is related to not being able to make really great future plans. That's why these types often get caught, even the very brilliant and sophisticated ones. And another way to interpret that, in my opinion, is it's like, oh, they didn't actually have access to their feelings. Now, I'm not an expert in that field of research. I know there's advancements being made every day, but the general understanding is that these people don't actually have feelings like you and I. And so it makes sense that their thinking would then end up predictably spoiling and deconstructing their plans with however they were going about doing whatever they were trying to do. And so I think it's an extreme example, but once I had a mentor who basically said you can learn a lot about the general kind of, normative human population by really getting curious about what's happening at the extremes in a given kind of diagnostic cluster. And so for me, that's always been evidence that, you actually have to have access to both and that it's not a simple equation where it's like, the more you give one, like the less you give the other. It's actually like it's cumulative in a way. And so it makes complete sense to me. And for anyone listening who's struggling with that, give yourself some grace. Like it takes time. Like I remember like the embodied experience I had when I was first able to really get out of my head, it did feel a little bit back and forth. Like with effort, I could like be in the feels, and then I would reorient back up here. But then, you work on it, and then with time, it does begin to get more integrated. And I actually think that's one of the things that San Pedro really helped me push into, was like being here, in the head and the heart more at the same time with more ease, I think would be the way to put it.
I'm curious if you're feeling that now.
Yeah. Yes, I am.
So taking your invitation to the listener, like, what's that feel like now?
Yeah, I think before it was like a two-way street. Like, I could be up or I could be down. But I think now it's a little bit more like, it's less of like a line from like head to heart that like you bounce back and forth between. And it's more, the experience is actually more in my extremities. It's more like in my hands, like, and in my feet. And I mean, it's all over, like the perception of just my moment to moment experience. That's something else that's just been and I would love to know your perspective on this, because I know there's like, it's stuff that I don't have a relationship to, but stuff around like chakras or meridian lines or something, but in really potent, what I would call like transformational spaces. So whether it's like a retreat or even if I'm one-on-one with someone in therapy, I will often feel it in my hands. They will like, it's not quite a tingle because it's warmer and softer than a tingle, but I do feel that sensation like very distinctly. And that's something that I'm feeling right now, just kind of dropping in with you.
That's really beautiful. Yeah, I got curious about that because I'm also feeling that now, especially when I saw you take a little beat and what seemed like a breath, and I took that myself. So the first book that we have people read, at least the first 3 chapters of it when they come to Ceremonia, is a book called The Mind Illuminated by John Yates. And it's this guide to meditation. And it was introduced to me by a dear friend who's the founder of a retreat guru, who had shared with me that he's had a meditation practice, been with gurus, done Zen retreats, etc., for decades. And when he got this book, it completely changed and upgraded his meditation practice. I was like intrigued by that because I've been yearning for a deeper meditation practice. So when I picked up the book for the first time about a year ago, reading 2-3 chapters in, the first thing I realized, what a novice I am in meditation. And the second thing that I really appreciated, it's written by a neuroscientist who then like decrypted a bunch of Tibetan scrolls and followed a bunch of practices and codified a practice of meditation that is in a way that's like really easy to understand and backed by science. What this reminds me of is in the first few chapters, you first take in the external, right? So the sounds around. Earlier I was meditating at a river. So the sounds of the river, the sun, my face, etc. Then bring it to the breath at the nose, and then try to pay attention to as much detail as you can on the inhale and on the exhale, right? And when you really tune into the breath at that level, the book claims that you can notice hundreds of sensations just in the inhale and exhale, which is wild. But as you upgrade in skillfulness of keeping your attention on your breath, then it's about holding the attention on the breath while holding peripheral awareness on the rest of the body, and then the emotions, and then the thoughts, kind of layering it all while holding attention on the breath. And I'm imparting this because what really struck me is that John, the author, says this practice is valuable because the breath is the most difficult thing to hold attention on because it's the most boring thing that you could possibly do as an individual. It's like,
oh my gosh,
there's nothing more boring than just paying attention to your breath. And so by training attention while holding peripheral awareness, you're able to train for mindfulness, right? Mindful awareness. And it was a long way of saying like my experience of holding the heart and the mind at the same time is holding that peripheral awareness of what's inside of me while I hold attention on different things, like hold attention on this call, right? Or this conversation we're having right now, hold attention on the time, etc. And just having the peripheral awareness of my feelings, my thoughts that are going through, my challenges, so on and so forth. And it's so valuable because we can start to engage with life with a little more distance. I like to say that when you're in the suck, the trick is to zoom in or to zoom out, right? Zoom in and be like, like what's actually going on? Zoom out and be like, okay, what's the big picture? Why is this happening for me? But the real gift of mindfulness is to be able to do both at the same time, right? Holding that paradox.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. What's coming up for me is it's taking everything you just said and then like applying this really important context point nuance of the imagination, where something I'm often saying to the people I treat clinically, because people will often be, and rightfully so, skeptical of whether it's using breath or using mindfulness or whatever it is in order to self-regulate, to feel better than you do. And what I have to say to them is I go, look, if I prompt you to reflect on and relive the worst experiences of your life, your palms are going to get sweaty, like your heart rate's going to increase, like, it's not happening to you right now. You're aware of that, but just the memory of it or the like being in the imagination of a similar scenario, is going to affect your organism in that way. And it's exactly the opposite way. And I'm just really present to how that's I'm a very imaginative person. That's how like teachers have always described me and past therapists and stuff. And as you were talking, I was just really present to how important presence is. And it doesn't need to be this, to your point, you can be aware of things in the periphery. Like you can be aware of like, whether it's literally just like in the periphery of your surroundings or like within your imagination, but to like, but to be here now, right? And how wherever your mind goes and like, in fantasy, like little f fantasy can have a really, like the impact should not be underestimated to like how it affects your ability to be mindful, how it affects you moment by moment, day by day, etc. To your point, earlier, I forget what you said, but you said something that reminded me of, you're talking about behaviorism. And I had a mentor early on, and she was very fond of saying, if we were talking about like a case or whatever it would be, she would say something like, well, we can make up whatever we want to make up about it. And when she first said it, it occasionally occurred to me as a little bit like dismissive, but I think the more experience I got, I was kind of like, oh, it is dismissive. And that's actually like the point. Because she's actually pulling us back to the present and saying like, yeah, but what story do we want to have like in our periphery, like in our imagination versus like, what is the stuff that's unfolding in this moment that we have more control over, that has more direct consequence to us?
The way that I'm taking that is this word transference that happens in the context of therapeutic support. And I think is especially important to recognize within the psychedelic container, right? If someone goes to therapy and their therapist is having a bad day, they're probably going to be okay. But if they go to a psychedelic facilitator and psychedelic facilitator is having a bad day, then so much of that energy can transfer to the patient. Yeah. And I think we've been kind of like circling this idea, kind of drawing out the meta level of the frameworks we're talking about, the knowledge that we have back into our personal lived experiences, you and me, that it's important to practice what we preach. And it's important that practice is grounded in a principle of growth, like a growth mindset to like constantly better humans ourselves. And I'm like really fond of bringing vulnerability in as a facilitator. Like first I'll say I'm not a licensed therapist, but I facilitate, you could say, therapeutic support quite often, right? And my practice is to first make sure that people can feel that I can hold them, right? That I've got enough of my shit together that when they're going through their stuff, that I am capable of being there for them with compassion and curiosity and with presence. But once that is satisfied, like I'm bringing in my humanness too, because I think it's not only important to practice what we preach, also to just demonstrate it too. I'm curious what your take is on that, especially since you're a clinician.
Yeah. It's when people will sometimes ask, do you go see your own therapist? And I've had lots of therapy, both very like traditional therapy and then more what I might call more kind of like cutting edge therapeutic modalities, whether it's like a type of coaching or psychedelics or like whatever it might be. And so one of the things I say to them is I say, absolutely. And if I feel like therapy can help with whatever it is that I'm working on, like with whatever edge I'm coming up against in my own journey and in my own growth, I will absolutely go seek that out. I'm taking a break from therapy right now, but one of the ways that I found him is I was actually reading a book that initially had application to a patient I was treating, but I saw a lot of myself in my own childhood in this very niche area that the man was studying. And so I go to the psychologist's website and I go, oh, he has a list of clinicians that he's trained, and one of them is based here in New York. So I call up this guy and I'm like, hey, I'm like, this is the kind of research I did. It's like, please, like, like, let's do this. And so there's moments, I share all that to say, it's like, there's moments where it's like, I need this, for me. I'm aware that it'll have positive impact on my work. But this is also like, this is just important for me to do, just as a person. But then there's other times where I'm kind of like, is this for me, or is this like self-awareness for sport? You know what I mean? Like, am I just trying to like, and I say it with humor, but I also think that there's a lot of value into aspiring to be at least 1 degree more self-aware than the most self-aware person that comes to see me, because if not, then how can I hope, to kind of help them or understand them or kind of guide them or whatever it might be. And so that's what first came up for me when you talked. The second thing was there's also a lot of just like the self-care stuff, like just being grounded, being nourished, like, sleeping, the very worst decently, every night, kind of like taking care of those things so your organism is finely tuned. But I also think too that piece always matters, but it matters less to me now, years into practicing as a therapist, than it did at the beginning. Like at the beginning, like if I couldn't have a good night's rest and, nourish my body and move my body before sitting down with someone, like maybe it was just all in my head, but it was just like, oh, like I'm not as grounded. I can't be as like finely attuned to you as I want to be. And I would do so much prep for their cases. I would reread notes and like do all this extra research and stuff. But I kind of feel like the older I get, maybe it just comes with confidence or experience, but there's less pressure on myself. Where now it's, I've earned the right to where like I can just sit down in front of them and it's like, okay, what are we going to talk about today? And like I have the tools and the awareness and the knowledge base, et cetera. And so, and it of course it depends on the person in front of me. I mean, if I'm growing my competency, if I'm helping a type of person with a problem I've never treated before, or they're a kind of person I've never worked with before, I might want to kind of go back to some of those older habits and routines. But those are the two things that came up for me as you're talking about, kind of doing the work, walking the walk. And it makes perfect sense. I mean, like, I don't know about you, but when I see like a personal trainer at the gym who isn't in the best shape, I wonder, I'm like, do you know like what you're talking about? Like, what I mean? Like if you're going to charge for it.
Totally. I feel inspired in this moment to up my game. It's funny that you said self-awareness is a sport, was it? Or growth as a sport. And I love growing. I love learning more about myself because it feels like a feedback loop of enriching my lived experience. But this statement that you made, that you've earned the right to just sit down with somebody and be like, okay, what's here, right? And I'm resonating with that because in my earlier years as a facilitator, same, would like do lots of study on the individuals, ask them about their history, so on and so forth. But as I've like come into what I perceive myself as more skillful and more confident and more clear about my orientation that I'm trying to drive people towards, which is to say compassionate presence, loving kindness, right? Their own presence is almost, and I say this with lightness, like their stories almost don't matter, right? The vast majority of the people that come, I don't know what they do. I don't know if they're married or not. I don't know if their parents are alive. I don't know what they're dealing with. And for a while, I was so like myopic in looking at the present moment that I didn't even create space in our ceremonial curriculum for them to share their stories. I learned later that it's important as an icebreaker for us to just be like, right, okay, where are you from? The typical questions like, where are you from? Like, are you married? Do you have kids? What do you do for a living? Et cetera, right? But in the back of my mind, I actually don't even believe that information is very valuable. Because in the same container, we can have a billionaire and we can have a homeless person, right? Well, usually not a homeless person, but, a billionaire and a starving artist, let's say. And ultimately, we're all human, We're all going to take our last breath, whether it's on a golden throne or it's on a street corner. And we all go through our subjective maximums. Like the maximum pain that you feel is the maximum pain that you feel. And that's what you know to be your maximum. That's your lived experience. And so, yeah, just really resonating with this comment that you made that you've earned the right to just sit in front of somebody, because that's, I guess through the lens of orienting people towards feeling themselves more, it almost feels like the continuation of our conversation around like, how much does trauma define us?
Yeah, I don't know if this is exactly where you wanted to go. This is just what came up for me, but it's there's been a similar transformation in recent years with like how I date. Because in the sense that, you make a move on someone or you're go on a date with them or whatever it might be, I think that there used to be a worse version of me dating, or like a worse like dater was the version of me who would go on the date, and let's say it didn't like lead to a second one. It was like there was a desire to analyze the behavior, or a desire to like reflect on like, well, like what did I do or not do? It was like so much like prep or like reflection or whatever it is, versus I think the more, let's just show up and like see what happens. Like, do I even enjoy this person? Like, are they enjoying me? Or whatever it is. And it's not that you can't have reflection or analysis, but it's like both anding it with the like, and then you sit down, you show up and see what shows up. And, you know, maybe it'll continue, like maybe it won't, but there's like a lower level of like attachment, I think, to outcome. Right. When like the version of me that would like prep so much for sessions or would really like think through a charming and like witty thing to say, like on a first date, it's not that the session or the date was bad even, but it's just, I don't know if it's, I feel like, you do that enough times and then it's like anything that we do, we integrate it, or not. And then eventually I feel like I have, like I said, it's like, oh, like I've earned the right to just show up. Like I've gone on, like I've had my dating phase, where you're just like dating lots of people and like seeing what you like or like don't like. It's like, well, now I'm going to show up and it's like, do I enjoy this? Is this a fit? Like, no, like that's okay, like compassionately. And so, yeah, it's funny how different things will work in different chapters of your life, like whatever you're up to. So, for example, if tomorrow I were to start a completely new job, I don't think I would necessarily take that approach. You know what I mean? I think I'd be like really analytical and asking lots of questions and like really self-reflecting, because that would be appropriate for that context. And so I like how kind of you almost went in like the opposite direction. And I agree that it's good to, in building a container, to let people share their story and help them feel seen. And that can be, you can't discount how powerful that is in terms of like therapeutic benefit. And I also like what you're saying, which is, and in some ways, it just doesn't matter. Like it doesn't matter if, which of the 36 patterns of childhoods that you experienced, this activity or this framework is going to be helpful to you.
Yeah, totally. It reminds me a little bit of Burning Man, where you'll greet somebody and both of you are covered in dust. Both of you just had a really challenging day in the hot weather. And you wouldn't know, like, if that person is, like, I met Elon Musk in line before. Oh, I shouldn't say where, but I met him before, and Burning Man. And this was before he was super famous. I think this was 2012. And you wouldn't know that was him, right? Unless you were specifically in that tech world at that time. So there's this humanization that happens when we discard, or we don't arrive with our stories, or we don't lead with our identity, And I think that's also really potent. And to your point about dating, recently that I was also in the dating pool. And I feel like there was like a trope that I saw somewhere about like dating a therapist or dating a psychologist. There's got to be, right? Like, oh no, I'm going to be psychoanalyzed. But what I've received as a comment multiple times is the same thing that's happened when I just meet new people, period. And it's like, they just feel like seen, they feel like understood. They feel like cared for. They feel like greater peace and ease. And I think it's also speaking to that transference that happens through what has become such a priority in my life, authenticity, right?
Yeah.
And you spoke about, you used the word attachment, like maybe the opposite of authenticity comes from what we're attached to. And one thing that you said was outcomes, but there's also attachments to identity, attachment to beliefs, to stories. And it's all full circle here. Like, what is it how are we defining ourselves in every given moment? And how do we live into the present experience without that,
Yeah, absolutely. It's, I get that question all the time. I've written about it and published content about it, like dating as a therapist. It's earlier in my training, in my clinical training, I was really self-conscious about that because I didn't want people to think that I was analyzing them. And so I think, and I believe I would overcorrect, where I would be like, specifically like not analyze, and like not do that. And that actually led me to make some like, I think, poor decisions in terms of like who to spend my time and energy on because I was so, concerned with like the clinical term for it would be like protest behavior. Like I was like so intent on showing you that I was not like this in this context that I ended up just acting like a total idiot. Like, I mean, being honest, like, and I mean, we all act as like an idiot in matters of, dating and courtship and love, of course. But I kind of graduated to this place where then I would kind of start to put what word am I looking for? I might be missing this, but it's I put the onus like on other people. And I would just then say, you're not analyzing the person you date? Like, bummer. Like, you know what I mean? Like, because I've been there and that was really hard, but I actually don't know if I've spoken about this publicly, but I've been kind of marinating on this like new take of it, which is like, why does it like where did the cultural story come from that like therapists are going to analyze me? I feel like the stigma only really exists if you're like a bad judgy therapist that's going to bring up someone's trauma constantly or bring up their mom and dad constantly. Like I think like a good therapist I actually think is earned a lot of sex appeal because they're able to accept you and be compassionate and be attracted to you, like even in all of your like flaws and filth, and I know my flaws, which we will not just, disclose on this specific podcast. But I just think that, when I'm really emotionally and physically connected to someone, there's that feeling of like authentic acceptance where it's like, I don't just tolerate these things, but I accept these things about you. And I think that in theory, clinical training would help you do that with more types of people, not less. And so I'm always kind of curious. It's like, oh, like you don't want to be seen and accepted compassionately? Like, great. Like, we're probably not a fit.
I feel like we just got the title of this podcast. Compassion is sexy.
It totally is sexy. It absolutely is. There's like this person I was talking to went on like, it was like some like sexuality retreat, not like gay versus straight sexuality, but like human sexuality, like eroticism. They told me this story where they were like it was like a man and wife that facilitated it. And this husband and wife kind of, when they opened their container, they said something like, we just want you to know that like, no matter like how badly you feel like you want it or need it, like we're not going to have sex with you, like on this retreat. Like that doesn't happen here. That's not what this is for. And the person I knew kind of rolled their eyes at it. Because I guess they were like much older, and I guess left a lot to be desired in terms of looks. But she said that there was this part of the experience where she wanted them so badly because they were so just compassionate and accepting and knowledgeable and non-judgmental. And it was just, transference to your point. Like it led to a larger breakthrough. But yeah, compassion is totally sexy is the point of that little anecdote. I thought that was so funny when she told me because I was like, whoa, I was like, I'm not ready for that retreat. I don't know if I'll ever be ready for something like that, but I totally get it. Like psychologically, like I get what they were pointing to.
Yeah, it reminds me of something I often cite, emotional psychologist Plechik that created, the primary, secondary, emotional.
Oh yeah, I love that wheel.
Yeah, it's like magnets to my refrigerator, and we give a printout to every Ceremonia member because we try to get people to stop using the word fine or okay or good when asked,
right.
Like, how are you feeling? Fine. Yeah. It's like, look at this wheel. I feel disgust or, something like that, right? But Plechik says that love equals safety plus joy. It's actually love equals trust plus joy. And it's like, wow, if you really think about it, you've got to, in order to feel love, you need to feel safe to be happy and happy while you're safe, and it totally makes sense. And what compassion and the word that you use acceptance can do is really help you feel safe to be who you are,
Right.
And I know we have all these frameworks in our mind. And one that I love is IFS, internal family systems. And it says that, these at the core of ourselves, like what we're trying to protect are these like wounded inner children, these exiled parts of us that carry the burdens or the voices of, I'm not enough, I'm not good enough. And one of the ones that I encounter so much when I facilitate connection is, do I matter? Like, am I important? Or do my feelings matter? Right. And that's so much of what we're seeking out there, talking about dating, talking about connection, talking about sexiness is like when you are with somebody and they're really present with you and they're looking you in the eyes and they're just like listening intently to your feelings and you could feel them caring and you're just like, oof, in this moment, I really matter. And that is what I think is sexy,
Yeah, totally. I agree. I think it's sexy. It's been kind of blowing my mind recently. I don't know if you resonate with this, but I'm definitely, I have dedicated my life, my career to people, connection, relationships, the study of psychology and human behavior. Like I think a lot about people. I think a lot about people in my life, people I'm interested in, people I treat. And so it probably comes as no surprise that I have spent a good amount of energy thinking about, my primary relationships, like my family, my closest friends, my partner or lack thereof. And I was just reminded recently that, that is one mode of being, like spending a lot of energy trying to find love and intimacy, maintain it, cultivate it, get more of it. But then there's this other mode of being that I think a lot of people are in, which is when they're like, they actually are spending just as much energy as me, if not more, avoiding it. Like not being in connection with it. And, there's a variety of reasons why someone might do that, as but it was just one of those things where it's someone who tries his best to be authentic and compassionate and who feels like those things are sexy. There's also this, I think, really important rub there, which is like, and depending on where someone else is at, with their journey, like what kind of state of consciousness they're at, it could send them running in the other direction. And that doesn't mean don't be authentic and compassionate. It means like, like have some discernment and some maybe even additional compassion, for them and protect your peace and all of the above. But I've been thinking about that recently, and I think it's like, wow, like, so, I mean, human beings are just some very strange creatures, what I mean?
For me, there's a yes and in there. There's a book by Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a prolific Buddhist teacher and author. He wrote 118 books before passing a few years ago.
Oh, wow.
And there was this book called How We Fight. And it was almost like a picture book, like very small, thin book that packed a lot of punch for what you can read, right? And I remember reading what I believe to be the very best apology that one could give. I want to share that with you and the listeners. He says, "I'm sorry. In that moment, I wasn't mindful or skillful enough to be with you the way you needed me to be." And when I read that, I was just thinking about all the people that I've hurt. And yeah, like in that moment, I was, I was under-resourced. I didn't have the tools of empathy or compassion. I wasn't allowing myself to feel the impact that they were having on me. I wasn't vulnerable enough, so on and so forth, right? I wasn't mindful or skillful enough. And my belief, and this is sort of my challenge to myself, is that as I develop my mindfulness and my skillfulness with my growth mindset, I am able to be with more complicated scenarios, more complicated people, right? And especially when I have less capacity in me, aka less resourcing in me. So I don't think that there are people that are beyond the purview of compassion. Because I often ask myself, WWDLD, like, what would the Dalai Lama do? And I asked this question in some other podcasts, like, do you think an hour with the world's best therapist, aka Joe Nucci, or an hour with the Dalai Lama would be more healing? And I would posit that it would be an hour with someone who is closer to the level of enlightenment. Not to say that you aren't, but it's just like,
no, I would recommend
I'd
given the opportunity, like go talk to the Dalai Lama, like for sure, and then come tell me what he said.
Yeah, and I think there's something to that, because when he had a shoe thrown at him by, I think it was like a Chinese activist one time, he smiled at that individual, afterwards. And it was just like, wow, that is such a high level of embodied compassion that anybody can be moved by it, I believe.
Once I was at a party, I was definitely not as compassionate as the Dalai Lama, but there was some compassion demonstrated within my defensiveness. But I said hello to someone that I thought was attractive, and they just kind of gave me, like, there's no other way to say it, just like a really like bitchy stare down, like, just like clearly trying to push me off. And I don't know if it was because I had a cocktail or two, or like whatever was flowing through me, but I remember just kind of smiling and cocking my head and being like, is that supposed to be intimidating? Are you okay? And I just smiled. And again, like, I think that the Dalai Lama probably would have, had less ego in it, because but there was a little bit of me that was like, enjoyed like the slight sliver of sadism that was in it. But I also remember it completely disarmed them, in that moment. And they were just, oh, like, sorry, like, then they basically gave me like, a minute of FaceTime and walked away. I mean, they would too. I mean, that was so uncomfortable, but I think it's one of the coolest things about the field, whether you're, primarily clinical and scientific or more spiritual and more woo-woo, as we've termed. It's that you can understand, like the analysis of that isn't that deep, right? It's like you can understand why that's disarming, and why that works. But the practice of doing it is much more difficult. and you can, anybody can. I really do believe that, but that's something that always trips me up about psychology, and all these frameworks and stuff. And then I fall for the most, obvious sales tactic. And I'm just like, oh, shoots. Like, makes sense.
Yeah. Well, surprise, you're human too.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, Joe, this has been such a fun conversation. Coming up with the line, compassion is sexy. I love that too.
Yeah.
And well, please share with the listeners how they can find you, and please share with the New York dating pool where, your phone number and where they can text you.
Oh. We will share the former, but I appreciate it. You can find me on all the socials. I'm most active on Instagram at Joe Nucci Therapy. JoeNucciTherapy.com also has links to all the different platforms and the Substack and every way you might want to keep up with me.
Cool. Well, I appreciate this conversation. It's been such a pleasure. Can't wait to see you next time we do in one of those events. And thank you for this exploration of like our stories of trauma, of your personal stories, and ultimately compassion and sexiness.
Yeah. Awesome. Can't wait to be back and can't wait to see you soon.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Modern Enlightenment. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to check out our website, subscribe to our online community, and check out our social media links in the show notes for more resources and updates.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to stay connected with our upcoming episodes, where we continue to explore the intersection of modern science and spiritual wisdom. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and keep shining your light.